Hi, I'm going to continue reading my book, which is The Giver of Stars by Jojo Moyes, and we are about halfway through chapter 12. So I'll start. Christmas was a muted affair. Marjorie didn't celebrate Christmas traditionally, it being associated with not one good memory for her, but Sven insisted and bought a small turkey that he stuffed and cooked and made cinnamon cookies from his mother's Swedish recipe. Marjorie had many skills, he told her, shaking his head, but if he relied on her to cook, he'd be the width of that broom handle. They invited Fred, which for some reason made Alice feel self-conscious, and every time he looked across the table at her, he managed to time it to the exact second she glanced up at him so that she blushed. He brought with him a Dundee cake, baked to his mother's recipe, and a bottle of French red wine, left in his cellar from before his father died, and they drank it and pronounced it interesting, although Sven and Fred agreed that you couldn't beat a cold beer. They didn't sing carols or play games, but there was something restful about the easy companionship of four people who felt warmly towards each other and were just grateful for good food and a day or two off work. That being said, all day, Alice feared the knock on the door, the inevitable confrontation. Mr. Van Cleve was a man used to getting his own way, after all, and there were few occasions more guaranteed to heat the blood than Christmas. And indeed, the knock did come, though not as she had expected. Alice leaped up, peering out of the window, fighting for space with a giddy and frantically barking Bluey. But it was Annie who appeared on the stoop, as cross-looking as ever, though, given it was a holiday. Alice couldn't really blame her. Mr. Van Cleve asked me to bring this, she said, the words popping from her lips like angry bubbles. She thrust an envelope at her. Alice held on to Bluey, who wriggled to be free and jump up to greet his new visitor. He was the most hopeless of guard dogs, Marjorie would say fondly, all sound and no fury, the runt of the litter, always stupidly glad to let everyone know how happy he was just to be alive. Annie kept one wary eye on him as Alice took the envelope, and he said to wish you a Merry Christmas. Couldn't get up from the table to say it himself, though, called Sven through the doorway. Annie scowled at him, and Marjorie scolded him quietly. Annie, you've been most welcome to stop for a bite to eat before you head out, she called. It's a cold afternoon and we'd be happy to share. Thank you, but I have to get back. She seemed reluctant to stand close to Alice, as if by mere proximity she risked being infected by her prediction for deviant sexual practices. Well, thank you anyway for coming all the way out here, said Alice. Annie looked at her suspiciously, as if she were making fun at her expense. She turned away and increased her pace back down the hill. Alice closed the door and released the dog, who immediately leaped up and started barking at the window, as if he had completely forgotten whom he had just seen. Alice stared at the envelope. What'd you get then? Marjorie sat down at the table. Alice caught the glance that paused between her and Fred as she opened the card, an elaborate fixing of glitter and bows. He'll be trying to win her back, said Sven, leaning back in his chair. That's a fancy romantic thing. Bennett's trying to impress her. But the card was not from Bennett. She read the words. Alice, we need you back in the house. Enough's enough and my boy is pining. I know I did you a wrong and I'm prepared to make amends. Here's a little something for you to buy yourself some fineries in Lexington and sent with the hope that it improves your feelings about your swift return home. This was always a frightful measure with my dear late Dolores, and I trust you will view it equally favourable. We can all let bygones be bygones. Your father, Geoffrey Van Cleve. She looked at the card, from which a crisp $50 bill slid onto the tablecloth. She stared at it where it lay. That's what I think it is, said Sven, leaning forward to examine it. He wants me to go out and buy a nice dress and then come home. She placed the card on the table. There was a long silence. You're not going, said Marjorie. Alice lifted her head. I wouldn't go if you paid me $1,000. She swallowed and stuffed the money back into the envelope. I will try to find somewhere else to stay, though. I don't want to get under your feet. Are you kidding? You stay as long as you like. You're no trouble, Alice. Besides, Blue is so taken with you. It's nice not to have to fight the dog for Sven's attention. Only Marjorie noticed Fred's sigh of relief. Right, said Marjorie, that's settled. Alice stays. Why don't I clear up? Then we can fetch Sven's cinnamon cookies. If we can't eat them, we can use them for target practice. 27th of December, 1937. Dear Mr. Van Cleve, you have made it quite clear on more than one occasion that you think I am a whore. But unlike a whore, I can't be bought. I am therefore returning your money via Annie's safekeeping. Please could you have arranged to have my things sent to Marjorie O'Hare's home for the time being? Sincerely, Alice. Van Cleve banged the letter down on his desk. Bennett glanced up from across the office and slumped a little, as if he had already guessed the contents. That's it, Van Cleve said, and screwed the letter into a ball. That O'Hare girl has crossed the line. 10 days later, the flyers went round. Izzy spotted one first, blowing across the road down by the schoolhouse. She dismounted and picked it up, brushing the snow from it so she could read it better. Good citizens of Baileyville, please be aware of the moral danger posed by the Packhorse Library. All right-minded citizens are advised to decline its use. Meeting Hall, Tuesday, 6 p.m. Our town's moral rectitude is at stake. Moral rectitude? From a man who smashed a girl's face halfway across his dining table, Marjorie shook her head. What are we going to do? Go to the meeting, I guess. We're right-minded citizens, after all. Marjorie looked sanguine, but Alice noticed the way her hand closed around the leaflet and a tendon ran tight along her neck. And I'm not letting that old... The door flew open. It was Bryn, his cheeks pink and his breath heavy from running. Miss O'Hare, Beth took a fall on some ice and broke her arm up real bad. They bolted from the library and followed him up the snow-covered road, where they were met by the bulky figure of Dan Meekins, the local blacksmith, carrying a whey-faced Beth across his chest. She was clutching her arm, and there were vivid dark shadows under each eye, as if she hadn't slept for a week. Horse went down on a patch of ice just by the gravel pit, Dan Meekins said. Checked him over, I think he's okay, but it looks like her arm took the full force of it. Marjorie stepped closer to peer at Beth's arm, and her heart sank. It was already swollen and dark red, 3 inches above her wrist. You're making a fuss, said Beth through clenched teeth. Alice, fetch Fred. We need to get her to the doctor at Chalk Ridge. An hour later, the 3 of them stood in the little treatment room at Dr. Garnett's, as he carefully set the injured arm between 2 splints, humming quietly as he bound it. Beth sat with her eyes closed and her jaw tight, determined not to let the pain show, consistent with her upbringing as the sole girl in a family of brothers. I can still ride though, right? Said Beth, when the doctor had finished. She held her arm in front of her as he looped the sling around her neck and tied it carefully. Absolutely not. Young lady, you need to spend at least 6 weeks resting it. No riding, no lifting things, no banging it against anything. But I have to ride. How else am I supposed to get the books out? I don't know if you heard about our little library, Doctor, Marjorie began. Oh, we've all heard about your library. He allowed himself a wry smile. Miss Pinker, at the moment the fracture appears clean, and I'm confident it should mend well, but I cannot stress enough how important it is to protect it from further injury. If an infection were to set in, then we could face having to amputate. Amputate? Alice felt something wash over her. Revulsion or fear, she wasn't sure. Beth was suddenly wide-eyed. Her previous composure evaporated. We'll manage, Beth. Marjorie sounded more convincing than she felt. You just listen to the doctor. Fred drove as swiftly as he could, but by the time they arrived back, the meeting had already been going almost half an hour. Alice and Marjorie crept in at the back of the meeting hall, Alice tipping her hat low over her brow and pulling her hair loose around her face to try to hide the worst of bruises. Fred followed just behind her, as he had done the whole day like some kind of guard. The door closed softly behind them. Van Cleve was in such full flow that nobody even stopped to look when they entered. Don't get me wrong, I am all for books and learning. My own son Bennett here was valedictorian at school, as some of you may remember. But there are good books, and there are books that plant the wrong kind of ideas. Books that spread untruths and impure thoughts. Books that can, if left unmonitored, cause divisions in society. And I fear we may have been lax in letting such books loose in our community without applying sufficient vigilance to protect our young and most vulnerable minds. Marjorie scanned the assembled heads, noting who was there and who was nodding along. It was hard to tell from behind. Van Cleve walked along the row of chairs at the front, shaking his head, as if the information he had to impart made him truly sorrowful. Sometimes, good neighbours, I wonder if the only book we should really be reading is the good book itself. Doesn't that have all the facts and learning we need? So what are you proposing, Jeff? Well, ain't it obvious? We have to shut this thing down. Faces in the crowd met each other, some shocked and concerned, others nodding their approval. I appreciate that there has been some good work done with sharing recipes and teaching the kiddies to read and all, and I thank you for that, Mrs. Brady. But enough's enough. We need to take back control of our town, and we start with closing this so-called library. I will be putting this to our governor at the earliest opportunity, and I hope that as many of you as are right-minded citizens out here will be supporting me. The crowd drained away half an hour later, uncharacteristically muted and hard to read, whispering to each other, a few casting curious glances at the women who stood together at the back. Van Cleve walked out deep in conversation with Pastor McIntosh, and either failed to notice them or had simply decided not to acknowledge they were there. But Mrs. Brady saw them, still in the heavy fur hat she wore outside. She scanned the back of the crowd until she spied Marjorie and motioned to her to meet her over by the small stage. Is it true about the married love book? Marjorie held her gaze. Yes. Mrs. Brady exclaimed softly under her breath. Do you realise what you've done, Marjorie O'Hare? It's just facts, Mrs. Brady. Facts to help women take control of their own bodies and their own lives. Nothing sinful about it. Hell, even our own federal court approved that book. Federal course, Mrs. Brady sniffed. You know as well as I do that down here we're a long way from federal courts, or indeed anyone who cares a lick about what they decide. You know our little corner of the world is highly conservative, especially when it comes to matters of the flesh. She folded her arms across her chest and her words suddenly exploded out of her. Darn it, Marjorie. I trusted you not to create a stir. You know how sensitive this project is. Now the whole town is alive with rumours about the kind of material you're distributing, and that old fool is stirring fit to burst to make sure he gets his own way and shuts us down. All I've done is be straight with people. Well, a wiser woman than you would have realised that sometimes you have to play a politician's game to get what you want. By doing what you've done, you've given him the very ammunition he was hoping for. Marjorie shifted awkwardly. Oh, come on, Mrs. Brady. Nobody pays any heed to Mr. Van Cleve. You think? Well, if Izzy's father, for one, has put his foot down. What? Mr. Brady has tonight insisted Izzy withdraw from the programme. Marjorie's jaw dropped. You're kidding. I'm most certainly not. This library relies on the goodwill of locals. It relies on the notion of the public good. Whatever it is you're doing, you have created a controversy, and Mr. Brady does not want his only child dragged into it. She raised a hand suddenly to her cheek. Oh my, Mrs. Nofcia will not be happy when she hears about this. She will not be happy at all. But Beth Pinker just broke her arm. We're already one librarian down. If we lose Izzy too, the library won't be able to continue. Well, perhaps you should have thought about that before you started mixing things up with your radical literature. It was then that she noticed Alice's face. She blinked hard, frowned at her, then shook her head as if this too were evidence of something going deeply wrong down at the Packhorse Library. Then she swept out, Izzy throwing a despairing glance their way as she was pulled along by her sleeve towards the door. Well, that's torn it. Marjorie and Alice stood on the stoop of the now empty meeting hall as the last of the buggies and murmuring couples disappeared. For the first time, Marjorie seemed truly at a loss. She was still holding a crumpled leaflet in her fist and now threw it down, grinding it under her heel into the snow on the step. I'll ride tomorrow, said Alice, her voice still emerged muffled from her swollen mouth, as if she was speaking through a pillow. You can't. You'd spook the horses, let alone the families. Marjorie rubbed at her eyes and took a deep breath. I'll take what extra routes I can, but Lord knows the snow has pushed everything back already. He wants to destroy us, doesn't he? Said Alice dully. Yes, he does. It's me. I told him where to put his $50, so he's mad he'll do anything to punish me. Alice, if you hadn't told him where to put his $50, I would have done it and in capital letters. Van Cleve's the kind of man can't bear to see a woman take any kind of place in the world. You can't go blaming yourself for a man like him. Alice shoved her hands deep into her pockets. Maybe Beth's arm will heal quicker than the doctor said. Marjorie gave her a sideways look. You'll work something out, Alice added, as if she were confirming it to herself. You always do. Marjorie sighed. Come on, let's head back. Alice took 2 steps down and pulled Marjorie's jacket tight around her. She wondered whether Fred would come with her to pick up the last of her belongings. She was afraid of going by herself. Then a voice broke into the silence. Miss O'Hare? Kathleen Bligh appeared around the corner of the meeting hall, holding an oil lamp in front of her with one hand and the reins of a horse in the other. Mrs. Van Cleve. Hey Kathleen, how are you doing? I was at the meeting. Her face was drawn under the harsh light. I heard what your man there was saying about you all. Yes, well, everyone has an opinion in this town. You don't want to believe everything you. I'll ride for you. Marjorie tilted her head as if she wasn't sure she was hearing right. I'll ride. I heard what you were saying to Mrs. Brady. Garrett's ma will mind the babies for me. I'll ride with you until your girl's arm is mended. When neither Marjorie nor Alice responded, she said, I know my way around every hollow for 20 miles yonder. Can ride a horse as well as anyone. Your library kept me going, and I won't see some old fool shut it down. The women stared at each other. So what time do I come by tomorrow? It was the first time Alice had seen Marjorie truly lost for words. She stuttered a little before she spoke again. A little after 5 would be good. We've got a lot of ground to cover. Of course, if that's too difficult because of your babies, 5 it is. Got my own horse, she lifted her chin. Garrett's horse. Then I'm obliged to you. Kathleen nodded at them both, then mounted the big black horse, steered him round, and was lost in the darkness. When she looked back afterwards, Alice would remember January as the darkest of months. It wasn't just that the days were short and frozen, and that much of their riding was now done in the pitch black, collars high around their necks, and their bodies swaddled in as many clothes as they could wear and still move. The families they visited were often blue with cold themselves, children and old people tucked up together in beds, some coughing or rheumy-eyed, huddled around half-hearted fires, and all still desperate for the diversion and hope that a good story could bring. Getting books to them had been infinitely harder. Routes were often impassable, the horses staggering through deep snow or sliding on ice on steep paths, so that Alice would dismount and walk, haunted by the image of Beth's red and swollen arm. True to her word, Kathleen would turn up at 5 a.m. 4 mornings a week on her husband's rangy black horse, collect 2 bags of books, and ride off wordlessly into the mountains. She rarely needed to double-check the routes, and the families she served met her with open doors and expressions of pleasure and respect. Alice observed that leaving the house was good for Kathleen, despite the travails of the job and the long hours away from her children. Within weeks, she carried a new air of, if not happiness, then quiet accomplishment, and even those families, swayed by Mr. Van Cleve's emphatic takedown of the library, were persuaded to stay with it, given Kathleen's insistence that the library was a good thing, and she and Garrett had honest reasons for believing so. But it was hard all the same. Something like a quarter of the Mountain families had dropped out, and a good number in the town, and the rumour mill had gone into overdrive, so that those who had previously welcomed them now viewed them with wary eyes. Mr. Leland says one of your librarians is with child out of wedlock after becoming crazed with lust from a romance novel. I heard all 5 sisters over at Split Willow were refusing to help their parents in the house after having their heads turned by political texts slipped into their recipe books. One of them has grown hair on the back of her hands. Is it true that your English girl is really a communist? Occasionally they even received insults and abuse from people they visited. They had started to avoid riding past the honky-tonks on Main Street, as men would catcall obscenities from the doorways or follow them down the street, mimicking what they claimed was in the reading material. They missed Lizzie's presence, her songs and her cheerful, awkward enthusiasms, and while nobody spoke openly of it, the absence of Mrs. Brady's support felt like they had lost their backbone. Beth stopped by a few times, but was so grumpy and despondent that she, and eventually they, found it easier for her not to be there at all. Sophia spent the hours she no longer had to fill with filing books by making up more scrapbooks. Things can still change, she would tell the 2 younger women firmly. Have faith. Alice plucked up courage and made her way to the Van Cleve house, flanked by Marjorie and Fred. She felt weak with relief when Van Cleve wasn't there, and it was Annie who silently handed her 2 neatly packed suitcases and closed the door with an all too emphatic slam. But once back in Marjorie's cabin, despite Marjorie's assurances that she could stay as long as she liked, Alice couldn't help feeling like an interloper, a refugee in a world whose rules she still didn't entirely understand. Sven Gustafsson was solicitous. He was a kind man who never made Alice feel unwelcome, and took time to ask her during every visit about herself, her family back in England, and what she had done with her day. As if she were a favoured guest, he was always quietly delighted to find there, not just a lost soul clogging up their living area. He told her about what really went on at Van Cleve's mines, the brutality, the union breakers, broken bodies and conditions she could barely stand to picture. He explained it all in a voice that suggested this was simply how it was, but she felt a deep shame that the comforts in which she had lived at the big house had been provided from its proceeds. She would retreat to a far corner and read one of Marjorie's 122 books, or she would lie awake through the unlit hours, her thoughts periodically interrupted by the sounds emerging from Marjorie's bedroom and their frequency. Their uninhibited nature and unexpected joyfulness left her feeling first acute embarrassment, then, after a week, curiosity tinged with sadness at how Marjorie and Sven's experience of love could be so different from her own. But mostly she would sneak glances at the way he was around Marjorie, the way he watched her move with quiet approval, the way his hand strayed to her whenever she was nearby, as if the touch of his skin on hers was as necessary to him as breathing. She marvelled at how he discussed Marjorie's work with her, as if it was something he took pride in, offering suggestions or words of support. She noticed that he pulled Marjorie to him without embarrassment or awkwardness, murmuring secrets into her ears and sharing smiles lit with unspoken intimacies. And it was then that something in Alice would hollow out, until she felt there was something cavernous inside her, a great gaping hole that grew and grew until it threatened to swallow her whole. Focus on the library, she would tell herself, pulling the counterpane up to her chin and blocking her ears. As long as you have that, you have something. Right, that was the end of chapter 12. So next time we'll be moving on to chapter 13. See you all soon.